Everyone. This is Heartspring, and here is our parent information training. Today we have Rikki Lane here from the CDDO of Butler County, and she is going to present on intellectual and developmental disability services in Kansas. So take it away, Rikki.
Yes, thank you. I'm really excited to be here also. I've been in the intellectual disability field here in Butler County for about 10 years. And then my previous life before that, I worked at the Sedgwick County CDDO. And then previously before that, I had some case management positions and worked at one of the special ed schools. So lots of years of experience working with our IDD population. So I'm really excited to share this information with you guys today. I will share my screen now. I like to start with a little bit of history about IDD services, not just in the state of Kansas, but across the nation. But in this particular presentation, I specify services in the state of Kansas. Back in the early 1900s, it was highly encouraged by doctors for parents to place their children in institutions, regardless of the type of disability they had. So that would include mental, physical, medical, intellectual, and even economic status, like our poorer population. Would have been encouraged by their physicians when the child was born to automatically enter them into these institutions. So having a handicapped child was seen as a burden to the family and the community at that time. So it was believed that with increasing vehemence and moral judgment, state officials in the 19th century viewed mentally retarded children as burdensome, dangerous, or both. Whether to protect them or restrain them, the reasoning went, idiots and imbeciles should be removed from society. And just as a side note too, a lot of this terminology that I'm using is the normal terminology from the early 1900s that we potentially see as offensive today. But as we move forward, that terminology also adapts throughout the times. Okay, so with this encouragement from physicians to enter their children into state institutions, this is where a lot of our institutions started to rise because it was believed that many children with disabilities could be educated to return to the community and lead productive lives. So they originally were seen as these kind educative type settings, and that they would receive this intensive training and be able to be reintegrated back to be productive members of society. So the underlying belief was that through proper education and humanitarian means, we could make the deviant undeviant, that we could change them to better fit the world. So in the state of Kansas, we had 7 state hospitals that were originally developed back in the early 1900s. So in 1866, the first state hospital was opened in the state of Kansas called the Kansas Insane Asylum, and it was founded in Osawatomie. In 1870, in Topeka, due to overcrowding at Osawatomie. In 1881, the State Asylum for Idiotic and Imbecile Youth opened up in Lawrence. And in 1887, the Lawrence Asylum was moved just outside of Winfield and renamed the State Home for the Feeble-Minded. The Winfield State Hospital is kind of one that's a little close to our heart here in Butler County and our neighboring county, Cali County, because a lot of the individuals that were placed at an early age at Winfield State Hospital actually have come into our services and are still with us today. And we actually have quite a few staff across the community as well, which work in our services within the local community services that worked at the state hospitals there. So they know what the setting was like at that time and have evolved with us along the route of community inclusion. In 1903, the State Hospital for Epileptics opened in Parsons. So around this time is when they started realizing that certain state hospitals needed to be specific based on individuals' diagnosis potentially. So they started opening specific hospitals for different things. And in 1914, Larned State Hospital opened as the largest psychiatric hospital for the mentally ill. And that's actually still an operating hospital to this day. So again, a different type of hospital opening for a different need. In 1914, the state sanctuarium for tuberculosis was opened in Norton and also served persons with mental retardation, which was later renamed the Norton State Hospital. And that's the name that it remained until its closure. And in 1960, Kansas Neurological Institute, or KNI, that some of you may know today, opened in Topeka to provide evaluation and treatment. So this was specifically for individuals to go and potentially receive a diagnosis, be tested, and then be referred out to a state hospital for treatment. And then in 1963, a second tuberculosis hospital opened in Chanute to help with some of the carryover from the tuberculosis state hospital in Norton. So around this time, parents started becoming really angry with the poor living conditions and lack of community services that were available to their children. A lot of the staff were overworked, with their ratios being about 1 to 50 with the individuals that were living in these institutions. There was a lack of therapists, a lack of doctors, a lack of medical care, of educational care. So the movement called the Reawakening is where a lot of parents started making a significant shift in the method and approaches of providing services with disabilities. So a few small groups of parents got together and they started really advocating for their children, and the movement spread quickly across the US and eventually it's a national movement. The National Association of Parents of Friends of Retarded Children was first registered as an organization in 1953. And after a few name changes, eventually came what we know now as the ARC. Some of you may be familiar with the ARC of Sedgwick, but that is actually a national, and it really stemmed from this movement of moving children or individuals out of this institutional setting to where they might have better community services, educational services, employment, offer better medical care. They really were initiating legislation to get involved in this movement as well to challenge the conventional wisdom that person with disabilities could not be helped. So in the 60s, we began to see community options becoming more available, with a recognition that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities could be trained to become productive and independent members of society. By the late 60s, a federal government's role in social welfare programs was increasing, and state aid to counties for public assistance needs was soaring. The political environment was ripe for change. So at this time, most of us that know anything about the 60s know that there was a lot of different movements during that time. It was a big rights time of our development, and not just for our population, but for us, most importantly, for our population. And SRS was established in the 70s as the state social services agency to assist with managing some of these new movements that were coming about. The Federal Healthcare Finance Agency began completing reviews of state institutions. So when the state was allocating funds to these institutions and started seeing all of these movements come about, then they started sending out agencies to kind of look into what was going on in these institutions. And kind of a big push from that came from President John Kennedy. He started the motion towards disability rights, as he had a sister with ID who lived in a private state hospital. Their family was afforded to pay for a private state hospital, so she had a little bit better care than what was funded through these public institutions that they were living in. But as a senator, he toured many of the institutions upon hearing the complaints and the concerns and seeing these movements coming through. And he became familiar with the limitations within the IDD system. So he created the commissions on mental retardation, bringing together a panel of clinicians, experts, and advocates to recommend the best service support to our IDD population. And that's where this Federal Healthcare Finance Agency came into play, and they started doing reviews, going in and visiting these hospitals. And upon their initial review, a paper published in the Healthcare Finance Review indicated that 15% of the facilities that had just one of these surveys had been notified of possible termination of funding. So almost instantly, they started realizing that, 15% of these state institutions aren't worthy of our funds. And so that even pushed the movement faster. So finally, in 1975, President Ford signed into law the Disability Rights Act. And then on a side note, these are actually pictures of the Winfield State Hospital and the Topeka State Hospital that were one of the last state hospitals to close within our state. So he signed into law the Individuals Disability Education Act, which granted children the rights of educational services in compared to their typical peers, and the Developmental Disability Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, which we refer to as the DD Reform Act. So IDA makes available free appropriate education, and DD assures that individuals with developmental disabilities, the DD Reform Act assures that individuals with disabilities and their families are able to participate in the design of and have access to needed community services, individualized supports, and other forms of assistance that promote self-determination, independence, productivity, and integration into all facets of community life. So we started refocusing all of our efforts into, more community services. And that started a revolution of closing down these state hospitals. So in the early 90s, the Community Integration Project begins to bring people out of the state institutions, and legislature authorizes for home and community-based services. And then we start seeing, with that lack of funding, a lot of these state institutions start closing. So in 1988, we had our first state closure in the state of Kansas, which was Norton. It was ordered closed by legislature. In 1998, 117 years after it opened, and some of us were already born by then, Winfield State Hospital finally closed. And like I mentioned before, Cowley County and Butler County absorbed many of those individuals. And then finally, legislature already approved recommendations to close Topeka State Hospital at that time as well. Okay, so then we have to have services outside of the state hospital. So they start working in 1990 to develop what we now know as the home and community-based waiver, approved for people with intellectual disability. The legislature approved that. In 1991, the Community Integration Project begins to bring people out of the state institutions. In 1994, Kansas Developmental Disability Reform Act passed, which named Community Developmental Disability Organizations, or CDDOs, as the gatekeepers into IDD systems. So this is how we kind of come into the play of applying for services. They needed basically a local management agency for individuals now to apply for and receive services in the community. And then by 1997, almost twice as many people are now being served with community services supports versus living in state institutions. So between 1991 and 1998, we saw almost a 50% reduction in census between community services and admissions to the state institutions. And to me, that's not a very long time. That's only 7 years that we were able to provide such a great service to families and communities in the population with this big push from our family and our communities. Okay, so what is the role of the CDDO? As the CDDO, we act as the single point of entry for this IDD services in our area. There's 27 CDDOs across the state of Kansas, and all of us are delegated certain counties. So some areas may have a bigger CDDO area, but technically they're more a rural area, so they would be their service area population wise is probably smaller. So there is a CDDO designated for every state in the community, or every county in the community, so that they can access local services in their area. We oversee the quality of services provided in our area. A lot of the affiliates will we have affiliated contractors that affiliate with us to provide the direct service so we can oversee that. And we advocate to the state for and local legislators for needed services and funding for IDD population services in the community as well. So we're continuing to push for bigger growth for our population. So like I mentioned, one of the tasks of the CDDO is to determine that eligibility, that individuals meet eligibility for IDD services. So I mentioned earlier, there was that one designated state hospital that would do evaluation and determine what's going to be the best fit for your family. So basically CDDOs are kind of filling that role as well. There's two different, with us, we're called intellectual disability services or developmental disability services. So with an intellectual disability, an individual must be diagnosed by over the age of 5 with an intellectual disability. And with that, they must have IQ testing administered by a psychologist or a clinician able to provide an ID diagnosis and determining what their level of functioning is. And then to meet this criteria, we must have a copy of the psychological evaluation submitted to the CDDO with the ICD diagnosis included. And then for a developmental disability, and examples of developmental disability would include your autism population, your Down syndrome, your seizure disorder. It's not limited to, but there are many other developmental disabilities as well. They must be diagnosed with the diagnosis by the age of 6 by a medical professional. Sorry. Okay. For an intellectual disability, they may have a diagnosis by the age of 6 from a medical professional in the form of a medical examination. And along with that, the CDDO is in charge of doing what we call an eligibility assessment, which we will show that because of their developmental disability, they have 3 or more deficits, substantial limitations in areas of life functioning due to that developmental disability. Okay, so when you're applying for CDDO, applying through the CDDO for services, some of the documentation that may be required depending on your local area would include birth certificate, social, medical insurance or Medicaid insurance if the individual or family is eligible, a current medical exam within the last 2 years, psychological evaluation if the family has had one, or if they're seeking services under that intellectual disability criteria. If the child is in school and receiving special education services, then we would like to review their individual education plan or their IEP. If an individual has a DPOA, a durable power of attorney, or a guardian over them, or has been adopted, we would like those records as well. And sometimes individuals might have a government issued ID that we would like to keep on file. The types of services available, and this may vary due to each CDDO receives local funding from their county tax dollars. And so some of those CDDO areas will utilize those funds to develop different types of services for their area. And you would need to contact your local CDDO area to see what types of services are available. But these types of services are available to most everyone applying across the state of Kansas. So the first service that everybody would be eligible for if they had Medicaid is targeted case management. And that is an individual that would help the family identify, select, and coordinate services in the community that they might need, and the natural supports can assist them with accessing those services. Now, if a family doesn't have Medicaid, there are some CDDO areas that have grants available to assist with covering that cost of case management for all of our families, because we really feel like this is one of the most important services our families can have in accessing all of those IDD services that are available in the community. And there may be services, additional services not available strictly through the CDDO, but we have a lot of community partners that we also partner with that can provide services as well. Adult day services is a program typically for your individuals who have completed their educational goals and are moving out of educational settings, but may not be able to participate in the activities that your typical peers would be, which may be continuing education or competitive employment in the community. So we do have day service options, which were, regular activities that an individual can participate in and feel accomplishment, personal reward, or contribution to the community. And some of that may be developing those work skills or social interactions or community volunteerism. There's a lot of different things depending on the program that individuals can access. Our services, again, are birth through death. So long-term services for individuals could also include residential supports, where an agency assists with daily living tasks and household chores, maybe even help with socialization and recreational activities for an individual. And this would all be provided in a non-family residential setting. So if for some reason, if an individual chooses that they no longer want to live under natural supports and they want to be as independent as possible, they can choose an option of residential services. And there's many different ranges of what that residential service might look like for someone. Maybe they're living in their own apartment and an agency is just providing staff a little bit at a time, or maybe they're living with a group of their friends and they all have one staff person that comes in and helps, cook dinner or provide directive on some of their life skills together. In-home supports is one-to-one assistance that's provided in the home, in the family home or the natural support home when the natural supports are unable to provide or unavailable. And these activities could include helping with learning self-care, household activities, participating in daily activities of daily living. They could provide some overnight respite or sleep support if for some reason this individual is somebody who's chronically up during the opposite hours of a natural support or family caregiver. This support could be available to them. And it may also include providing transportation for any of those tasks listed above. Supported employment is a service that provides support in a way of a job coach to assist individuals receiving community competitive employment within their community. Assistive services would be for some of our population who require medical or assistive equipment support in order to be as independent as possible in their setting. Wellness monitoring would be a regularly scheduled nursing visit by a registered nurse for individuals who have medical conditions that require ongoing oversight. So, if an individual wants to live independently in their home or with their natural supports, but they really need some medical oversight, this could be a service that is available to them as well due to a medical condition. And along with that, a medical alert for an individual potentially who wants to live independently, but has a medical condition that could hinder that or provide some, safety concerns there. It would be a small device that is worn by the individual that provides that 24-hour emergency help if needed. And then our specialized medical care is a service for individuals who require long-term nursing support for medically fragile or technology-dependent individuals. So those are just a brief oversight of our major services that are offered through the HCBS waiver, the home and community-based waiver that we talked about before. Some of these services are age-based, and some of them do have a waiting list in the state of Kansas, but some CDDO areas, like I mentioned before, have either state or local funds available to assist families with these pending needs. And if the needs cannot be met with state or local funds, then a request to bypass the waiting list could be reviewed and a case manager can assist them with submitting that request. I talked about case management service, and I really do feel like it is one of the most valuable services for our population, because they really are the ones that will assist families in accessing that medical, social, educational, and other needed services in the community that they potentially could live as most independent and inclusive as possible with with those supports. So the goal of a case manager is to promote maximum independence and successful integration into the community through their person-centered planning. And so what is person-centered planning? This is, again, something that they came up with this movement. As you know, individual rights is something where it's a process. It's not a document. It's a process of exploring what the individual's vision for their life is in their home, who their friends and community supports are, what do they want to do for work or have meaningful day activities, and any other area that is important to them. So you're really having those intensive discussions with your natural supports, with your individual themselves. The case manager is coordinating all of this conversation to try and really develop this person-centered process on how they want to live their best life. This includes the identification of outcomes that the person wants to achieve in their life, and the identification of the circles of support that are available to assist them in reaching those outcomes. So the overall goal now with individual rights is to find out, okay, what is it that you want to do in the community? What does your best life look like for you? And then they will help write out a plan each year on how to help them achieve that best life, and then providing supports and resources on supports that can help them achieve that. And then each plan will address individual goals, whether that's behavioral, medical supports, transition planning, and self-advocacy. So each year should be able to continue moving forward on what you want to do for self-advocacy. So we're really trying to, have this big push for, individuals having the lead on advocating for what their services look like for them. So person-centered planning means conducting all activity from the individual's point of view, so what's important to them, and then balancing in the input from others as to protect their decisions, but also making sure that they're meeting their best life. If you're interested in accessing person-centered planning or any of the other IDD services offered in the state of Kansas, please feel free to contact your CDDO serving your county to set up an intake meeting or access their application process, which might be different depending on each CDDO area. And if you have additional questions regarding this process, regardless of the county, you can still feel free to contact me at the CDDO of Butler County, and I can assist you through the process for your area as well. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rikki. That was jam-packed with great information. I'm so excited for everyone that's going to be able to see it. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope everyone enjoys it.